value conflicts, value assumptions. All of us have different things that we value. What we value might be ranked in a different order. So we value some things more importantly than others, and others might have it completely reversed. Sometimes the things that we value is relative to the circumstances or the situation. Oftentimes, the things that we value are at the root of our disagreements. And if we can understand that and try to figure out what it is that the author of a text, of a book, or the person you're speaking to, if we can figure out what it is that they value, that they're not actually saying, it might help us understand the discussion better. We assume quite a few things about the world. We assume that other people value the same things we do. We assume they find certain things important just like we do. We also make assumptions about the way the world works, and those are called descriptive assumptions. Assumptions are just unstated beliefs we hold. And when we're talking about arguing for something or trying to prove something, many times the things that we value or find important are not being said, but they are what is leading us to the conclusions we hold. We might not be aware of this, and the people that we're talking to might not be aware of this. But it's important to try and understand the value assumptions that are driving or motivating the reasoning. So just remember that assumptions are not being stated clearly because we just assume them. We take these things for granted, but they're really important in trying to understand how people are reasoning towards their conclusions. One of the things we want to try and do is understand what those values are, but this can get tricky because if the person that we're talking to or the book that we're reading is not openly stating what they find to be important, we have to infer what those values are, or we have to guess. We have to do some guesswork. And that can get tricky because we can be very wrong about what we think they actually value. You can't read people's minds. You can't read people's hearts. You might think you can. Neither can I. No one can. We might think we can figure out what people value by the context, and that's what we're trying to do. But just keep in mind it can get tricky, and we can be very wrong about our conclusions. Here's an example. Here's an argument, right? We should not legalize recreational drugs because recreational drugs lead to more violence and other sorts of crimes, right? So there's two sentences there. We should not legalize recreational drugs because they lead to other crimes and violence. All right, so the conclusion is to sell or not to sell recreational drugs. The conclusion is no, we should not. We should not sell recreational drugs. Why? Because they lead to violence and other sorts of crimes. Okay, so we understand that. Now, immediately, if you think we should legalize recreational drugs, you're going to attack that second statement. You're going to say they don't actually lead to violence and other sorts of crimes. But just take a step back for a minute and think about what it is that the person values when they're making that statement. When they say we shouldn't sell recreational drugs because they're going to lead to violence and other sorts of crimes, what are they not saying about things they find important? What's important to this person? You could call it public safety. You could call it a concern, care and concern for others, not wanting to see harm done to others. They're not saying that, but that's what's implied by that sentence. And so what's really going on here is a couple of things. Number one, they believe that selling recreational drugs is going to lead to violence and crime, and that's a bad thing because they value public safety, the safety of others. They value the community or the government making laws that will uplift or uphold public safety. And because they value public safety, they don't think we should sell recreational drugs. So they're not saying that part about public safety or concern for others. It's implied. So if you agree that they should be sold, you're going to attack the idea that they lead to violence and other sorts of property crimes maybe. But you could also make an argument that selling recreational drugs is actually a benefit to public safety. Now, I think you'd be hard pressed to figure out how to do that. I don't personally think that they're going to enable or uplift public safety, but that's what you would want to do. You've figured out what it is this person actually values. They value public safety, and that's really what's going on when they want to reduce crime, reduce violence, is a desire for public safety. So this value they have, call it public safety, is an unstated abstract idea that tells you what they find to be important. So values are just the things that we find important, and there can be hundreds of them. All right. So, for example, if you're the kind of person who likes to jump out of airplanes and go swimming in the ocean in a shark cage, then you desire or you find adventure in your life to be important. If you like to travel across the world, you find those things important. Whereas I don't find them nearly as important as reading books or going to school. So there's nothing immoral about you liking to travel or jump out of airplanes. There's nothing immoral about me liking to read books and go to school. This is, when we're talking about values, this is not necessarily a discussion about right and wrong, what's moral or immoral, ethical or unethical. We're just talking about things that you find to be important. So if you like to jump out of airplanes, you desire something like adventure, spontaneity, excitement, whereas I might desire knowledge and education. You can value both of those things. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just trying to point out that this doesn't have to do with morality or ethics, really. And it's also not the case that if you value one, it means you don't value the other. This is not an either or sort of thing. One thing you can do is actually just think about the kind of things that you value. Now, researchers and scientists can actually classify values, and they can group values into basic values that people find more important than others. For example, there's a theory that you can predict someone's political leanings, whether they're going to be more conservative or liberal, Democratic or Republican, if you can figure out their value structure. If you can ask them questions that draw out certain things they find important, like freedom or authority or order or sanctity, if you can figure out where a person lies on this continuum, whether they value freedom more than order or sanctity more than freedom, if you can figure those things out, then you can make a prediction about where they're at politically. My point is not to get into that discussion of politics. It's just to say that we all value things, and it doesn't have to do with whether we're a good or bad person. And it would be important for you just personally to try and think about what it is that you value in life. Is it your health? Do you diet and work out? Is it the growth of your mind? Do you desire knowledge? Do you find education valuable? If you're listening to something like this, then you probably do value education and knowledge. Do you value quality relationships? Do you value a relationship with God or the transcendent? So it would be beneficial to you if you wrote out the things that you value, because then you might be able to understand why you believe some of the things you do. You might value tradition. You might value world peace or equality. There's just a lot of different things that you might value. Not all of them are necessarily grand values like justice and world peace. It could be something more mundane like creativity. Now, once you understand that people, all of us have certain things that we value and find important, we don't always know what they are, and they actually guide the way that we think. They direct the conclusions that we come to sometimes. You also should understand that we prioritize them differently. So, for example, I might value adventure in my life. I might value creativity, but I value those less than I value knowledge and education. My brother, for example, would be someone who would probably reverse those. He values things like excitement and adventure more than he would knowledge and education. But the intensity or the degree to which you hold certain values explains your value priorities or your value hierarchy. But the relative intensity or the degree of intensity with which you hold these values, that's your value hierarchy. That's your value priorities. And the way we prioritize our values can often lead to some of the disagreements we have. For example, when we think about gun laws, right? Every time there's a school shooting, there's always going to be an uproar around the country about gun laws and gun rights and gun safety. So on one side, you'll have a group of people who are saying we need to enact stricter gun laws. And on the other side, you'll have people saying, no, making stricter gun laws is not the answer. We should do something else. Well, I don't think we should get into the trap of looking at both sides as an either or. One side is good and benevolent and moral, and the other side is evil and vicious and hates America. Right? I remember listening to a late night talk show host after one of the school shootings, and he basically said, if you don't agree with the idea of stricter gun laws, you hate children. right? He just made this sharp dichotomy between the two sides. You're either someone who values stricter gun laws or you hate kids, right? Well, I don't think that that is helpful at all. But if you understand value assumptions and value priorities, it might help you understand how the other person thinks. So the person who wants to see more gun laws enacted values collective responsibility. They think it's important that the community, the state, the government ought to enact laws that further increase our public safety, and that's a good thing. The other side doesn't necessarily disagree with that, but the other side values individual responsibility more than they value collective responsibility. So they value the personal responsibility of the individual gun owner. They're going to say that the gun owner needs to take more responsibility for the possession of their guns or something like that. So you have collective responsibility and individual responsibility. Both of these are good values. It's just that in that context, in that discussion, people are weighing them differently. And that's an example of value priorities. The last thing to understand is that values can actually shift and change in their priorities depending on the context, depending on the situation. For example, you might be somebody who highly values freedom of speech, right? Just across the board, you value freedom of speech. But then you might also value individual and public safety. And this is a controversy over something called hate speech. You might believe that certain things people say will incite violence, and so they should be prevented from saying those things. So in one scenario, you're somebody who values freedom of speech, but not in this situation or that situation. We all do that. We all value things differently in different orders, and sometimes they change depending on the circumstances. The point in critical thinking is that you try to understand what the other person values or what you value to really understand what's motivating the argument. And the values are not necessarily stated up front.